this session. We are really happy to have Professor Jay Garfield, a very distinguished scholar and internationally acclaimed expert on Buddhist philosophical tradition. We are very happy that he has accepted our invitation and agreed to give a seminar. Professor Garfield is a very well-known name among the philosophy people who are interested in philosophy. He is currently a Doris Silbert professor at the Humanities at Smith College. He's also a professor of philosophy at the University of Melbourne, visiting professor of philosophy and Buddhist studies at Harvard Divinity School, and adjunct professor of philosophy at the Central University of Tibetan Study. Professor Garfield also specializes in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, philosophy of language, ethics, many other topics. He's also very well known for his authoritative translation of various Buddhist philosophical texts, particularly the Nagarjuna's famous treatise Mula Madhyamatharika, and that translation is considered to be an authoritative translation of that particular book. Apart from that, he has written extensively on so-called popular philosophy, and for particularly people like us who doesn't know the complexities of philosophy, but still can acquire a taste of what is there in this subject. So again, we are very grateful. So Professor Garfield, you may start.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be visiting at the IIT in Gandhinagar. And I'm just getting my screen share going. And we're going to, of course, as we do these days, use PowerPoint as a kind of scaffold for all of this. This is a paper that is about Buddhist philosophy, but I think that it's one that should be of interest to anybody, even people who don't care at all about Buddhism, but it's going to demonstrate just how much the Buddhist tradition has to contribute to our own reflections on who we are and what we know of ourselves. But it's really a paper about illusion and immediate experience. And so I hope that it will be of general interest. I think that it will. Let's just see. Okay, so here's the plan. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Buddhist perspective on the role of illusion. Then we're going to turn to this big question of immediacy and immediate experience. Then we're going to begin our tour through an arc of Buddhist philosophy, beginning with the Madhyamaka philosophy introduced by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century, then moving to Yogacara, which arises in about the 3rd century. We'll move way up to the 9th century to Shantarakshita's attempt to synthesize Madhyamaka and Yogacara. Then we'll take a swing through Zen and come back to conclude with what all of this has told us about our knowledge of ourselves. So let's begin. Buddhist thought and practice is aimed at solving the problem of ubiquitous suffering, identified in the first of the Four Noble Truths. One of Buddhism's central insights and the motivator of much Buddhist philosophy and practice is contained in the second Noble Truth, the idea that the root cause of this suffering is confusion about the fundamental nature of reality. A confusion that leads to pathological attraction and aversion, which themselves are the proximal causes of pervasive suffering. That confusion, in turn, is always analyzed in terms of illusion. And illusion is always glossed in the Buddhist tradition, as it is in almost all classical Indian traditions, as a phenomena whose mode of appearance is discordant with its mode of existence. That is, as something that exists in one way, but appears to exist in another. Only by overcoming this illusion, Buddhist philosophers argue, can suffering ever be extinguished. That primal confusion that lies at the root of our existence is pervasive and it's complex. It involves taking that which is impermanent to be permanent, that which is a source of suffering to be a source of happiness, that which is only conventionally real to be ultimately real, that which is interdependent to be independent. And the important point for our present purposes is the thesis that our experience is permeated with illusion, and that this applies to our experience of our own minds as well. In the case of our own minds, pervasive confusion manifests first as the conviction that we are immediately and indubitably aware of the contents of our own minds, and second, as the superimposition of subject-object duality on primordially non-dual experience. Each of these ideas deserves a little bit of preliminary comment. There's an overwhelming temptation, ramified in philosophical theories of mind and consciousness, even today, to believe that to have perceptual experience is to know the content of that experience, that to be in a cognitive state is to know that state, and that these inner states are present to our introspective powers just as they are. Another way to put this, as did Wilfrid Sellers, is that impressions and thoughts appear to be simply given to us as the events that they are, as instances of the types that they instantiate. This is one of the deepest forms of the myth of the given, and the one that is most difficult to extirpate. We forget too easily that our knowledge of these states is mediated by our language and conceptual or apparatus. When we attribute beliefs, knowledge, or other intentional states to ourselves or to others, we are always engaged in an act of interpretation. We use language to model our inner lives. When we attribute sensory experience to ourselves, we assign ourselves inner states constructed on the model of the external properties we take to be the typical causes of those states. For present purposes, the important point is that even though some models such as this for self-knowledge is overwhelmingly likely to be correct, that is, it's overwhelmingly likely that when I attribute myself a belief, I do that mediated by language and attribute to myself a state that's modeled on assertion. When I attribute to myself a perceptual state, I give the content of that a color that's modeled on external color, and so forth. The point, though, is that it appears to us that these states are simply given to us as the states that they are, and that interpretive aspect is occluded from us. This is an example of cognitive illusion. A second, subtler cognitive illusion, one that is rarely thematized in Western philosophy, except in the tradition of phenomenologists such as Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, and those who follow them in the embodied, embedded in an active approach to cognition, is subject-object duality. But this is an aspect of cognitive illusion thematized quite deeply in the Buddhist world. There's another aspect to the delusion of duality. Just as it's hard to shake the feeling that we have immediate access to our inner states, it's hard to shake the feeling that we are unified, independent subjects who simply register the presence of objects around us, objects which exist pretty much as we find them, and that are delivered to us through our senses. A consequent aspect of this illusion is that our mode of self-knowledge is entirely distinct from our way of knowing objects. The idea is then that we know ourselves immediately, but everything else is known merely as an object. Once again, a bit of reflection suggests that this is a deeply confused understanding of the structure of the world, of our place in it, and of the nature of our experience. We know that we are biological organisms embedded in the world. We know that our perception consists not in the transduction of properties that exist outside of our heads into an inner space, but rather in the construction of a cognitive model as a consequence of sensory stimulation, and that everything we experience as an object is in fact a perceptual cognitive construction. So we know that the illusion that we stand against the world, taking it all in as transcendental subjects, is just that, an illusion. But knowing it doesn't help. That illusion is hard to shake. These are two overarching cognitive illusions that no doubt give rise to a cascade of more specific cognitive illusions. But it's the broad framework that concerns me here and that concerns Buddhist philosophers, including the 7th century philosopher Chandrakirti, the 9th and 10th century philosophers Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, the 15th century philosopher Tsongkhapa in Tibet, his successor Go century, Pato Rinpoche in the 19th century, Dogen in 10th century Japan, and a host of others who have thought about the structure of experience and the way that pervasive illusion manifests in the domain of self-knowledge. To overcome that illusion, we have to first identify the illusion itself. It's of the very nature of illusion that when under its thrall, we are not aware that we are its victims. When we see a mirage as water, if we are thirsty, we head in that direction. In order to avoid a pointless trek through the desert, we must first come to know that we're seeing a mirage and not an oasis. Only when we become aware of the illusion can we determine just why it arises and work to ensure that we do not succumb once again. In the case of the mirage, we discover that it's merely a refraction pattern produced by the temperature differences in the air over the desert stand. And when we understand its causal basis, we can then work to overcome the illusion, to see the world right. We can put on polarized sunglasses, or we can learn to recognize the subtle differences between the light refracted in a mirage and that reflected from the surface of real water. Buddhists are not alone in identifying this illusion. Not only do philosophers in the traditions, such as Advaita Vedanta, problematize this way of understanding experience, but philosophers in the West, such as Hume, Heidegger, and Sellers, criticize this view. Nor are the Buddhists' Indian opponents, such as those in the Nyaya Vaisheshika tradition, the only ones who defend the accuracy of the experience of subjectivity. Many in the West have made philosophical careers out of articulating this view, prominently including Berkeley and Descartes, but also many contemporary philosophers among the so-called new phenomenologists, who embrace an account of the immediacy of our awareness of our own subjectivity, despite their rhetoric of embedding in action and embodiment. In this essay, I want to explore one of the most profound illusions diagnosed in the Buddhist tradition and one of the most difficult to overcome. The illusion that our access to our own experience is immediate and largely veridical, that we have direct first-person access to our own minds, and that the duality between subject and object that structures our understanding of our experience is primordial. This is the illusion that we are subjects standing over and against a world. That is the conviction that while we may know the external world only through the mediation of our sensory and cognitive, that we know the world only in virtue of a second immediate access to the output of those faculties. I'm first going to explore the motivations for the doctrine of immediacy. I'm then going to provide a brief account of Buddhist views about experience and the pervasiveness of illusion. Then we'll turn to the real task, considering this long arc of Buddhist philosophy that addresses this illusion. My aim is to show that the Buddhist tradition gets this roughly right, and that we can learn a great deal about subjectivity through careful attention to the multiple ways in which Buddhist philosophers have considered this issue. This is hence not simply an exercise in the history of philosophy. It's an attempt to shed light on contemporary debates on consciousness by drawing on classic Buddhist resources. So let's start with the allure of immediacy, where the slide is now. It is easy to see both why people spontaneously believe that they have immediate and veridical access to their own perceptual and cognitive states, and why philosophers have ramified this intuition into sophisticated theories that articulate and explain that supposed immediacy. Apperception, as Buddhists recognize when they enumerate 6 rather than 5 sense faculties, including the introspective or apperceptive sense faculty, the manas vijnana, is perceptual in structure, presenting us with an apparent object, apparently distinct from our subjective apprehension thereof. Perception irresistibly feels like it presents the world to us as it is, independent of the peculiarities of our perceptual system and independently of the conceptual resources that filter perception. In the same way, apperception feels like it presents our own cognitive, affective, and perceptual states to us just as they are, independent of the structure of our apperceptive system and of the conceptual categories in terms of which we understand our own inner states. In the case of perception, we experience the apple as though its redness, texture, and sweetness are just there in the apple. They only await our veridical sensory systems to deliver those properties to our mind, where they are reproduced just as they exist in the external world. The mediation of that experience by our eyes, our nervous systems, and our brain is invisible to us. And that invisibility leads us to take that awareness to be entirely immediate. And even if we remind ourselves of this complex mediation of our perceptual encounter with external objects, we find ourselves thrown back on the sense that at least the sensory experiences themselves, the sensation of of sweetness, the sensation of smoothness are immediately available to us, even if we agree that the apple itself is only known through their mediation. Something, we presume, is simply given in sensory experience. Even mediation, we might think, presupposes something immediate to perform that mediation. This, I believe, is an almost irresistible attitude towards sensory experience. We might say that we have evolved to take our own experience to be given in this way. That does not mean that it is the correct way to understand our experience, or that it is natural for us to do so. Nature doesn't track truth. Nature tracks reproductive success. We've evolved to reproduce, not to reproduce the world. In the case of apperception, the sense of immediacy is, if anything, even greater. For even if we can remind ourselves of the complex mediation of our perceptual experience, even if we can shape the view that our perceptual experience is given to us in immediate awareness, it's hard to shape the idea that we know our own cognitive states, our thoughts, intentions, beliefs, imaginings, and emotions immediately. It just seems to us that we know what we believe just in virtue of believing it. That we know how we feel just by feeling that way. The mediation of introspective awareness by the introspective faculty is cognitively invisible to us, as is the conceptual structure in terms of which we categorize and know our experience of our inner lives. Mediation therefore seems inconceivable. Our inner states present themselves to our awareness as though they are just given to us. But even though this is a perfectly natural attitude towards our awareness of our inner lives, once again, nature is no guarantor of truth. And what we see in each of these cases is the seductive power of the myth of the given, the myth that there is a dimension to our experience independent of our epistemic instruments, of our pramanas, and independent of our conceptual framework. We get seduced by the idea that even if in the end we know the world only through the perceptual and conceptual mediation, it can't be mediation all the way down, that there must be a basic level of experience to which we have immediate access that we know veridically. But while this myth is powerful, both psychologically and philosophically, it is a myth. And only by coming to understand that myth can we exorcise the philosophical demon to possess us. I'm going to show that Buddhist philosophy of mind and epistemology offer a powerful tool for undermining the myth of the given. And so we now turn to Madhyamaka, to the idea of mediation and first-person knowledge. The central insight of Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka, and there's Nagarjuna on the top of the slide, as adumbrated by his commentator and follower Chandrakirti on the bottom, is that all phenomena are dependently originated and empty of any intrinsic nature, that nothing exists ultimately, and that the only mode of existence is conventional existence. The general picture is well enough known that I'm not going to spend much time on it here. Chandrakirti distinguishes three dimensions of dependent origination: causal dependence, mereological dependence, and dependence on conceptual imputation. That is, from the standpoint of Madhyamaka, every phenomenon depends for its existence upon a network of causes and conditions. Every whole depends on its parts, and every part depends on the wholes in which it figures. And everything depends for its identity on conceptual imputation. For present purposes, I want to focus on one of these and on its relationship to emptiness. That is, dependent on conceptual imputation. This is sometimes heard of as idealism, but it's not. The point is not that the mind brings phenomena into existence as a cause, but that the identities under which phenomena appear to us, and hence the ontology of the world that we inhabit and experience, is entirely dependent on the conceptual resources by means of which we understand the world. We might see this as grounded in the Indian idea of pramana, a term that denotes an epistemic instrument or warrant, but which derives from the root ma, to measure. Now, it's well known that within the Buddhist world, there's a school of thought associated with Yogacara called the Pramanavada school, developed by Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who developed a particular account of pramana, restricting the number to two: perception and inference, pratyaksha and anumana. But I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with the much more general idea that pramanas, or means of knowing, mediate our knowledge of the world. And to do that, we can accept all of those initiated by the Nyaya school, including testimony and analogy. Chandrakirti urges that the list should be open-ended, that anything we can use to measure the world can count as a pramana. We might follow this measurement analogy that would have always been front and center in the minds of Indian philosophers in conversation with Western philosophers of the 20th century, who were responsible for initiating the movement to which we now refer as naturalized epistemology. I have a philosopher, Paul Feyerabend, the first one, the top guy on the left there, who lived from 24 to 94. The 20th century American philosophers, Willard Van Orman Quine, also on the top, 1908 to 2000. Wilfrid Sellers, down on the bottom, who died only recently, and Paul Churchland, who's still with us. These more contemporary philosophers each emphasize, in slightly different but broadly congruent ways, the fact that our perceptual and conceptual apparatus function as, to use Paul Feyerabend's apt phrase, measuring instruments, or we might say pramanas. That is, just as we use a telescope, not to see a telescope or to see the light refracted in its lenses, but use it to see planets, stars, and nebulae, we use our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin, not to perceive sensations, but to perceive objects. Sorry, I've been forgetting to do this. There are two closely related points to this analogy. First, we do not know the objects of our sensory experience directly, but rather through the mediation of our senses. Another way to put this point is that we do not register external objects or their properties and then somehow bring them into our minds. Instead, we construct them in our central nervous systems in response to sensory stimulation, neural impulses, and the consequent upstream neural activity. Just as a radio telescope receives radio waves from distant objects and transduces them into visible images, our sensory faculties produce experiences in response to energy impinging on our periphery, of which we are never directly aware. The apparent directness of perception is, as Feyerabend and Churchland remind us, an illusion. Secondly, we can only interpret the output of a telescope correctly if we have a reasonable understanding of how it works. This is obviously true of radio telescopes, but it's true of optical telescopes as well. To put the point crudely, if we don't know how the instrument that we are using to mediate our access to the world works, we don't know whether we're looking through a high fidelity telescope or a kaleidoscope. We don't know whether we're using a properly constructed radio telescope or a virtual reality game. Once again, the same point applies to our senses. If we don't know that our senses are working properly, we don't know the degree to which what they deliver us is accurate information. But even if we know that they're as good as anyone else's senses, to really know what's going on in the world with which they put us into contact, know how they work. There we go, sorry. And of course, we have no clue regarding what anything on the other side of our senses could be like. We can only experience the output of these sense faculties, not the input. So another aspect of cognitive illusion that pervades sense perception is the illusion that what we experience is something external to us. To keep the Indian Buddhist view of sense experience in view, and to move further in the direction of Quine, Sellers, and Churchland, recall that Indian epistemologists and philosophers of mind, including Buddhist philosophers, identify the sixth sense faculty, the manas vijnana, the introspective faculty, by means of which we know our current cognitive, affective, and perceptual states. I'm going to go back to this slide. And that introspective sense is also a measuring instrument, a pramana, and is delivering us a report on the contents of our mind. This means that our access to our own inner states is also mediated by an instrument that delivers us only indirect information about our inner life and whose internal workings we do not fully understand. As a consequence, even our sense that we know our own cognitive states directly and accurately is an instance of cognitive illusion. Instead, our knowledge of the inner domain, like that of the mediated, and delivers us not information about what they are, but about how they appear to us, given our particular cognitive architecture. With these ideas in hand, we can return to Chandrakirti's idea that all phenomena, inner and outer, depend for their identity on conceptual imputation, and hence exist only conventionally, not ultimately. Let's focus on some of what we can say about our introspective processes. First, we learn to attribute mental states to ourselves and to others. They don't simply emerge in our consciousness as states of particular types. Secondly, the sortals under which we become aware of our inner states and under which we ascribe them to others and to ourselves are necessarily conceptual. That is, we must acquire the suite of concepts involved in our shared conception of mind, including concepts such as those of belief, desire, sensation, etc., in order to be capable of any attribution, whether we're attributing states to others or to ourselves. And hence, as a condition of any awareness of our own inner states as states of any kind. That's what Chandrakirti means by conceptual imputation. Our awareness of our own cognitive and perceptual states, just like our awareness of anything else, is not direct, it's mediated by conceptual imputation. We owe our cognitive ontology and so our self-conception and our experience of ourselves to our conceptual repertoire. This in turn means that language is essential to our self-knowledge, and this in two important respects. First, it is through language that we acquire most of our concepts, particularly the sophisticated abstract concepts pertaining to mind. But second, when we turn to the concepts of the propositional attitudes like belief, desire, and so forth, it is language that is the model for these concepts. The concept of belief, for instance, is parasitic on the concept of assertion. In order to believe something is to be disposed to say it. When we attribute beliefs, we attribute state that stand to sentences, just as utterances do, that is, as their contents. So when I can say, I believe that snow is white, just like I can say, I say that snow is white. So when I attribute that belief, I'm using the saying as the model for the kind of state that I'm attributing. We report beliefs and experience them, as Sellers was to argue much later on the analogy of inner saying, by directly experiencing inner particulars that just look like a belief that snow is white. So inasmuch as language is constituted by and derives its content from convention, so does thought. And this is the sense in which Chandrakirti can assert that thought exists only conventionally, that is, as dependently originated. All of this brings us to emptiness. In the Madhyamaka framework, to be empty is to be empty of intrinsic nature. That is, to exist in dependence on causes and conditions, to be mereologically dependent, and to be dependent on conceptual imputation. It's to exist only conventionally, not intrinsically. And this, we have just seen, is the mode of existence that our inner states enjoy. They are empty, dependent on conceptual imputation, and have only conventional identities. This isn't second-grade kind of existence. To say that the objects of our experience exist conventionally is not, in a Madhyamaka framework, to say that their mode of different existence is different from some ultimate reality that stands behind them. Instead, it's to say that nothing exists ultimately. The only kind of existence anything can have is conventional existence. This is because nothing exists independently of causes and conditions, independent of its parts or of the wholes in which it figures, or independently of conceptual intuition. And this allows us to understand the Madhyamaka analysis of the most fundamental cognitive illusion. The illusion of the immediacy of our knowledge of our minds and of the givenness of our own inner states and processes, our direct knowledge of them as the kinds of things that they are independently of concepts. This is the illusion that Wittgenstein, Quine, and Sellers, each in their own way, worked so hard in the 20th century to diagnose and cure. But we can put this just as easily in terms of 2nd century Indian Madhyamaka. The fundamental cognitive illusion, this is the bumper sticker, the fundamental cognitive illusion is to take our mental states to exist intrinsically rather than conventionally, and for our knowledge of them to be immediate, independent of conventions. This illusion is pervasive, instinctive, and profoundly self-alienating, obscuring the deeply conventional character of our own existence and self-knowledge. And this illusion is what, according to Buddhist philosophers, lies at the root of our grasping and aversion, and hence of the root of the pervasive suffering of existence. Now we're going to turn to Yogacara and the difference between duality and non-duality. So we're changing from the Madhyamaka tradition of Buddhist philosophy to the Yogacara tradition, the second great Indian Mahayana tradition. So, Yogacara tradition, and there we have Vasubandhu and his brother Asanga tradition, offers a somewhat different analysis of emptiness and of cognitive illusion. It's a bit of a commonplace, both in canonical sources and in contemporary Buddhist studies, to see Yogacara and Madhyamaka as incompatible rival positions regarding the nature of reality. But that's not the only approach, and there's a good line of thought in Tibet that's gaining ascendancy in contemporary scholarship, according to which they simply represent distinct perspectives on emptiness. Madhyamaka approaching emptiness from the side of the object, and Yogacara from the side of the subject. I think that's a really good way to think about it. There's a little bit of a difference, but we'll see how to reconcile that difference. The difference is that while Madhyamaka takes emptiness to be the emptiness of intrinsic identity or existence, Yogacara takes it to be the emptiness of subject-object duality, or the emptiness of externality to mind, of the objects of mind. Let's consider each of these formulations in turn, in each case considering how this analysis offers an account of cognitive illusion. We'll see that when we join the Yogacara understanding to that we've gleaned from Madhyamaka, we get a more complete understanding of this illusion. Yogacara accounts of experience suggest that we just as we're wired for the illusion of immediacy, we are wired to thematize our experience through the framework of subject-object. We take ourselves on this view to be pure subjects and the objects of our experience to be delivered to us by our senses and cognitive apparatus. They appear to stand over and against us as distinct. We take ourselves to know ourselves immediately, to know our objects only through the mediation of our epistemic instruments. And this duality of subject and object seems to be given to us as the primordial structure of our experience. Our continual reciprocal and causal interaction with that environment on this view allows our cognitive systems to construct a world of experience, complete with objects and their properties. And that world includes the objects we experience as external, as well as objects such as sensations and thoughts that we experience as occupying an internal space. In each case, we take those objects to be distinct from the subject that apprehends them. As Wittgenstein put it in the Tractatus so beautifully, just as the eye stands to the visual field as the unseen seer. But just a bit of reflection yields the conclusion that this duality is illusory. And this is the principal insight of the Yogacara tradition, as well as philosophers such as Heidegger and psychologists such as James and Eleanor Gibson in the 20th century West. As we argued above, perception doesn't deliver independently existing objects to our sense of subjectivity. Those objects don't exist outside of us with the same properties that appear as photocopies in inner representations. That is to say that we as subjects are not outside of the world of our experience. All of these aspects of our experience, the independence of our perceptual objects, subject-object duality, and immediate awareness of internal representations are illusory. They're superimpositions, ajasas or samropas. Instead, we are organisms embedded in an environment of which our bodies and faculties are part. Our subjectivity is constituted by that embedding. And the only way in which we can become aware of any object is by constructing it as an object in our field of consciousness. Objects, that is, do not appear to subjects. They are aspects of subjectivity. This isn't mysticism. This is just good cognitive science and good sense, but both by Buddhist insights and arguments and by the best cognitive neuroscience. This then is a second dimension of pervasive cognitive illusion. Madhyamaka analysis, as we saw in our discussion in the previous section, reveals that the objects we take to exist intrinsically are empty of that existence, and instead exist only interdependently and conventionally. That points to an illusion regarding the objects of our knowledge, as well as the way to understand those objects correctly. Yogacara analysis, as we've just seen, reveals that the subjectivity that we take to be primordially dualistic in structure is empty of that subject-object duality and is instead non-dual in nature. That points to an illusion regarding the subject of knowledge, as opposed to the object that we get in Madhyamaka, as well as to how to understand subjectivity correctly. And once again, on a Buddhist view, these illusions are the roots of suffering. We're now going to put these two ideas together to put the Madhyamaka and the Yogacara together through the 9th century Indian philosopher Shantarakshita's synthesis. There's Shantarakshita, and there's the two verses from his text, Ornament of the Middle Way, Madhyamaka Alamkara, that we're going to be considering. Consequence of the analysis that we've just considered, that Madhyamaka and Yogacara are not incompatible schools of thought, but are rather mutually supplementary. One explores emptiness and illusion from the side of the object, the other from the side of the subject. But while this analysis stems from an exegetical tradition that has origins in Tibet, there's a second approach into the synthesis that we can find in India, and that's grounded in Shantarakshita's remark in the Ornament of the Middle Way, that Yogacara offers an account of conventional truth and Madhyamaka an account of ultimate truth. The auto-commentary to these verses explains that this means that Yogacara provides the complete analysis of conventional truth and Madhyamaka the complete analysis of ultimate truth. The claim might seem odd for two reasons. First, while it's clearly intended to vindicate both philosophical systems, it seems to place them in the very hierarchy that leads to the disparagement of Yogacara in favor of Madhyamaka. Yogacara, Shantarakshita seems to be saying, is okay if you only care about how things appear to be, but Madhyamaka tells you how they actually are. And this is how some commentators on Shantarakshita read these verses. But second, although it's natural to think of Madhyamaka as presenting an account of ultimate emptiness, it seems a system like Yogacara, according to which subject-object duality and the externality of the objects of our experience are entirely illusory, captures our ordinary conventional sense of the nature of reality. After all, how many ordinary people think that way? Nonetheless, my own view is that Shantarakshita avoids deprecating Yogacara, and he gets the relationship between Madhyamaka and Yogacara just right. We just need to read him with more care. On the Madhyamaka side, things are pretty straightforward. The ultimate truth is the emptiness of all phenomena, and that is the central idea of Madhyamaka. If we really want to understand the nature of reality per se, Madhyamaka is the school that takes us there. But then what does that leave as the task of Yogacara? Just to provide a second best understanding of ultimate reality? Do we really want to say that Yogacara is just Mahayana for dummies? Or is it an account of how ordinary people think about reality? I don't think either of those alternatives makes any sense. Shantarakshita is encouraging us to take Yogacara seriously. And nobody thinks that the person in the street takes duality and externality to be illusory. So he can't mean that Yogacara is meant to be an exposition of ordinary people's common sense view of the world. But we can see how to read Shantarakshita as our co-equal role for Yogacara, and explaining how Yogacara provides an understanding of conventional truth if we think hard about what it is to understand conventional truth. To understand conventional truth is to understand not only what its content is, but how it comes to be, and how it comes to be taken to be so seriously as truth. The Madhyamaka analysis of emptiness and its relation to conventional truth tells us what emptiness is, as well as what conventional reality is. But it doesn't give us an account either of how we come to experience conventional truth, or of why it is that we take it to be more than conventional. That Shantarakshita sees is the central task of Yogacara. The principal analytical tool by means of which this is accomplished is the rubric of the three natures and of the three naturelessnesses, described in the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, on which Shantarakshita is implicitly commenting. In the 7th chapter of that sutra, an interesting question is posed. What does the Buddha mean by emptiness? The reply is that emptiness is intended in 3 senses: naturelessness with respect to characteristic, naturelessness with respect to causality, and ultimate naturelessness. In virtue of being natureless in each of these 3 ways, every object of experience, the sutra argues, also has 3 natures. Corresponding to naturelessness with respect to characteristic is an imagined nature. Corresponding to naturelessness with respect to causality is the dependent nature. And corresponding to ultimate naturelessness is the consummate nature. For those of you who like to think in Sanskrit, those are the Parakalpita, the Paratantra, and the Paranishpana Svabhavas. These natures and their corresponding naturelessnesses provide a positive characterization of conventional truth, while allowing us to understand ultimate emptiness. Let's briefly consider each pair of nature and naturelessness in turn. To say that all phenomena are natureless with respect to characteristic is to say that things considered apart from their appearance to sensory consciousness, that apart from their things don't have any properties that we perceive them to have. When we see roses as red and violets as blue, but the colors that we see are generated by our visual faculties. Different kinds of sense faculties are sensitive to different wavelengths of light, and so to different colors. To ask what the color of a rose or a violet is, independently of who sees it, me, a bee, a bird, and so forth, is just nonsense. Their color is not part of their nature, and that is to say, they are natureless with respect to that characteristic. Nonetheless, in ordinary perceptual experience, we imagine them to exist outside of our consciousness, just as we perceive them. That is their imagined nature. To say that all objects of experience are causally natureless is to say that they arise as objects of experience only through their causal interaction with our sensory and cognitive faculties, that we don't simply encounter objects in an immediate way. Their dependent nature is the fact that they are not independently existent entities on which we just happen to stumble, standing as objects over and against our subjectivity, but rather are constructed through these complex, opaque causal processes, and so are non-dually related to us. These 2 natures provide an analysis of conventional reality and of our tendency to reify it. Conventional reality is the reality populated by the things we imagine to exist independently of our minds, with the characteristics we perceive them to have, but which in fact are constituted by our minds. And they have those only in virtue of our deceptive cognitive processes. Since it's only through these processes that we become aware of objects, and since these processes are invisible to us, we are systematically fooled into thinking that the world exists as it appears, that what is conventionally real exists ultimately. This is the Yogacara analysis of the conventional. Note that nothing here is inconsistent with the Madhyamaka analysis. Instead, Yogacara supplements Madhyamaka with a cognitive and epistemological explanation of that reality and of our relation to it, just as Shantarakshita suggests. Now, things are ultimately natureless, apart from the conditions of our own subjectivity. We can't assign any nature whatsoever to them. The objects we apprehend, the contents of the world we inhabit, since they appear only subject to the conditions of our own consciousness, have no nature of their own. Their consummate nature is this fact, their emptiness of subject-object duality, of characteristics, and of anything that could constitute their essence. This is the Yogacara analysis of emptiness and of its relation to conventional reality. Once again, nothing here contradicts the Madhyamaka analysis of emptiness as absence of intrinsic nature, or of emptiness as extensionally identical to dependent origination. On the contrary, we can see Yogacara as providing an analysis of that claim in terms of profound cognitive illusion. The ultimate nature of things is their lack of any nature in virtue of their conventional reality. Conventional reality is the other side of this coin. It is simply the illusory aspect of things, and in particular, their appearance to us just as though they existed ultimately. Shantarakshita's synthesis then demonstrates that a Buddhist perspective on experience that takes both Madhyamaka and Yogacara seriously can make sense of how deeply illusory that experience is. We're now going to leave India for China and Japan and do a little bit of Zen just for fun and talk about emptiness, selflessness, and the paradox of self-alienation. Ideas from both the Madhyamaka and the Yogacara traditions made their way through China into the Zen tradition. And there we find a somewhat different and perhaps more profound and even more troubling synthesis. We can get a good feel for it in several essays by the Chinese-educated Japanese Zen philosopher who lived in the 13th century. I have in mind especially his essay Gabyo, which means painted rice cakes, and his other essay Genjo Koan, actualizing the fundamental point. Dogen saw very, very clearly that the pervasiveness of cognitive illusion regarding our own subjectivity opens up a paradoxical abyss that threatens any conviction that we could ever truly understand ourselves. The central idea is this: since even our own subjectivity is present to us only in an illusory fashion, we are subject to illusion not only regarding the true nature of the experiences we appear to have, but even with regard to those appearances. It's not that we know our inner experience, but might be wrong about what lies behind it. Dogen argues that we don't even know our inner experience. Commenting on a Zen aphorism that a painted rice cake can't satisfy hunger, Dogen writes this in Gabyo. So I'm going to read this with you. It's a beautiful passage. The paints for painting rice cakes are the same as those used for painting mountains and waters. For painting mountains and waters, blue and red paints are used. For painting rice cakes, rice flour is used. Thus, they are painted in the same way and they're examined in the same way. If you look for, I'm jumping down, if you look for some other kind of painted rice cake, you'll never find it. You'll never grasp it. A painted rice cake at once appears and does not appear. This being so, it has no mark of old or young, no trace of coming or going. Just here, the land of painted rice cakes is revealed and confirmed. What's he doing? Okay, oh, sorry, that's the last one. Dogen is using painted rice cakes here as a metaphor for the very illusion we are discussing, something that appears to exist in reality, but which is only a facsimile of that reality, a painting of a rice cake, not a rice cake. In this opening passage that we just examined, he rejects the seemingly obvious idea that although we apprehend only appearances, that is, painted rice cakes, something real stands behind them that we would love to really see, that is, real, non-painted rice cakes. Instead, he suggests it's painted rice cakes all the way down. Mountains and waters, that is a standard Zen metonym for the actual world of objects and processes, are as painted as well. Nothing in our experience can be described as something that we encounter as it is. Our very experiencing it can only be understood as a way to paint it. Perception and conception are constructive, an idea that we've already seen in Yogacara. But Dogen continues, since this is so, there is no remedy for satisfying hunger other than a painted rice cake. Without painted hunger, you have never become a true person. There's no understanding of this painted satisfaction. In fact, satisfying hunger, satisfying no hunger, not satisfying hunger, not satisfying no hunger, can be attained or spoken of cannot be attained without painted rice cakes. For some time, study all of these as a painted rice cake. What's he saying? In this passage, Dogen turns the metaphor, which isn't so hard to accept, when applied to the external world, since that is pretty standard Yogacara stuff, inward to come to the real point. Even when we consider our own cognitive states, they too are painted rice cakes. Excuse me for one moment. Out you go, out you go. Sorry, the dogs want to help me explain this, but they don't do it very well. To the degree to which we're aware of them, we paint them. If we took anything to stand behind them, to the degree to which we become aware of it, or think of that supposedly more real thing, we could only do so by painting it again. So if we thought that the moral of Buddhist illusionism was that we only encounter perceptual experiences instead of real objects, we're wrong. We're not going deep enough. It's that we don't even encounter real experiences, only illusions of experiences. And if we thought with a bit more sophistication that our encounter with those illusions was even an encounter with actual illusions, Dogen says we're wrong. There too, we only see illusions of illusions. This is about as vertiginous an account. There we go. This is about as vertiginous an account of experience as one could possibly imagine. We are not on this account even immediately aware of the conscious states we mistake for the direct awareness of external objects. We're not immediately aware of anything, and there's no foundation for perception or for conception. Dogen invites us not only to peer into a bottomless abyss of groundlessness, the groundlessness of reality, of knowledge, and of consciousness itself, but to leap into it in the recognition that the only way, to know ourselves is to forsake even the possibility of self-knowledge. True self-knowledge on this understanding is not, as one might think, the achievement of an immediate awareness of our own minds or their contents, of an awareness of our own subjectivity and of its structure. It's instead the recognition that there can be no such awareness. But this should not lead us to despair. Instead, Dogen urges, it leads to a profound self-understanding. We are nothing but conventionally real, interdependent beings, among other beings, participants in a boundless and groundless web of dependent origination, in which nothing has any true nature, but in which everything can be understood in a matrix of interdependence. Dogen articulates this terrifying but also reassuring vision in the following well-known passage of Genjo Koan. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. When we examine our own being, we discover that we have none, that all that we experience is a painted rice cake. That's not to deny our reality, but to affirm that reality as interdependent and as groundless, like the reality of everything else. We're not consigned to a second-class reality, opposed to the real reality of real rice cakes. Instead, we enjoy the only kind of reality that there could ever be, interdependent reality. But lest we think that this insight itself constitutes realization, the understanding of reality, or of our own nature, Dogen reminds us that this too is and can only be one more illusion. Last section, finally, knowing ourselves. We have been exploring a trajectory of thought regarding illusion in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, beginning in ancient India and landing in medieval Japan. The exploration is hardly exhaustive. We've omitted dozens of philosophers and hundreds of texts, metaphors, and arguments. I hope, however, that this brief survey gives you a feel for the way in which initial Buddhist reflections on the way that primal confusion grounds pervasive suffering, coupled with an analysis of reality in terms of the two truths and their paradoxical union, leads inexorably to a critique of the immediacy of experience, and thence to the insight that illusion is not something from which we escape, but something woven into the very fabric of our being. The most profound aspect of this understanding, I hope you've seen, that this fabric is woven from threads that are themselves illusory. Those threads are the conviction that we know ourselves and the conviction that we even know the illusory experiences that mediate our awareness. All of this suggests an aporia, a perplexity. True self-knowledge can only be the acceptance that there is none, and even that fact is nothing but illusion. The great death, as the Zen tradition often characterizes awakening, is indeed a leap from a very high cliff. Fortunately for us, however, fortunately, we're asked, the abyss into which we are asked to leap is bottomless. And so we need not fear a painful landing. Thank you very, very much. And now we're back together.
So thanks a lot, Professor Garfield, for this remarkable talk. Okay. So now, so the session is open. If anybody have any comments or questions, please go ahead. Students, anybody? Yeah.
May I start with a
Sure.
almost and first of all, thank you, Garfield, for a brilliant and very profound exposition. It's very difficult to sum up such enormous systems of philosophy in such a short space of time. I'm curious to know, it's an accessory question, not a very essential one. To what extent do these thinkers, these Buddhist philosophers, as we may call them for the sake of convenience, to what extent do they actually refer to the Buddha himself? And therefore, to what extent do they build their own system, fairly independently of the Buddha ultimately? What is the place of the Buddha himself in their thought and their systems? I'm a bit curious to understand this.
Yeah, I think the place of the Buddha is actually huge, because all of these shastras that we're looking at are all grounded in sutra sources. Now, some of those, of course, are Mahayana sutra sources, and some people might, question their authenticity and so forth. I want to leave that question aside. But Buddha Vachana, the speech of the Buddha, provides the touchstone for all of these. And it's the teachings of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, of impermanence, interdependence, and selflessness. And the fact that suffering is grounded in attraction and aversion that are in turn grounded in primal confusion about the nature of reality that forms the basis of all of this. So that's where it starts. I don't want to claim that the historical Buddha said all of the things that Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna and Shantarakshita said. That would be foolish. Nobody would be interested in them then. Nobody cares about somebody who mindlessly parrots what somebody else said. Rather, these are articulations of that tradition. And in the same way that you might say of somebody working today that her work is very Platonic or Aristotelian, you don't mean by that she's repeating the words of Plato and Aristotle, but that her words are inspired by a long tradition that began in Plato and Aristotle. Or if we say that somebody is pursuing a Vedanta program right now, we don't think they're mindlessly parroting the Upanishads of Shankaracharya, but are developing ideas that originated in that tradition. All of these thinkers are recognizably grounding their ideas, taking as a touchstone Buddha Vachana.
Thank you.
So, Professor Garfield, if I may ask a very naive question, could be, so it seems that there is a parallel between the thinking of various Buddhist schools and the so-called modern philosophers in Western traditions, particularly the postmodernist and also the phenomenologists like Sartre or say even Hegel, which you mentioned. And particularly, I was stunned by the emphasis of the importance of language, as Hegel has always emphasized, and there is probably a parallel here. Is it correct to say that this parallel exists, or is it just an illusion in our mind?
No, I think it's absolutely there. And it is also true that it's not accidental. That is, there's a kind of entanglement, to choose a different metaphor, of Buddhist thought and Western thought that begins with the interactions between Buddhist and Greek philosophers in very early periods. This has been well documented in Bactria and in Persia, that give rise to the set of ideas that informs Madhyamaka in India and that informs the skeptical tradition, the Pyrrhonian tradition in Greece. So we start with that entanglement, and then we get these philosophers separated at a very great distance And just as Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosenberg suggested, we could recover that entanglement by looking at either particle. And so we find the traces of that interaction tradition running from Pyrrho through Berkeley, through Kant, through Hume, into Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and so forth, just as we see it running through Nagarjuna, through Chandrakirti, to Shantarakshita, and into Tibet, and into China on the other hand. And so we are starting from an initial interaction. And of course, the Silk Road, both the Maritime Silk Road and the Asian Silk Road, provided fairly constant interactions between the Mediterranean, where Western philosophy was developing, and India and China, where Buddhist philosophy was developing constantly. So when people think of these as intellectually independent silos, they're just ignoring history. And buying into a weird early colonial myth that somehow Europe discovered an undiscovered Asia or some bullshit like that. I just don't have any time for that. So indeed, these similarities in thought are very real, and they're not accidents. They result from the history of philosophy, which was entangled from the very beginning.
Thanks. That's really great. There is a question in the chat box by Ritik. He says that conventional reality is very convincing because it comes along with the drives of grasping and aversion.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of suffering, is it the fear or desire more primordial than conceptual reality that appears only as an excuse to propagate them? So you may look at the chat box.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, actually. And it suggests that somebody's been reading Shantideva. So this discussion of fear is really, really interesting. If you pay attention to one of the most commonly used Buddhist icons, both in India and Tibet, the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of life, you see that it represents the realms of transmigration in the center, but everything is inframed by death. And death is always there at the periphery. And the real central point behind that representation is that the entire wheel of cyclic existence, or of our experience of suffering, is in fact propelled by a kind of subliminal awareness of our own impermanence and the inevitability of death. And it's an awareness that we typically push, just like in the icon, to the periphery. And we try not to think about it. And the suggestion is that by pushing aside our awareness of this primordial fear of death, we allow it to be a constant cause of suffering. So positive self that's going to be permanent and that's going to outlive our bodies. It leads us to see things as perhaps prolonging our lives, cosmetics that will make us look younger, or that magical medicine that will let us just live a few years longer. It leads us to the fear of anything that threatens our existence. And so, yes, I think that the central insight in a lot of Buddhist psychology is that primordial fear of death is the kind of base note, if you want, that holds together confusion, attraction, and aversion. Thank you for that. The philosopher who makes that most explicit is Shantideva in his text Bodhicharya Avatara, which is an 8th century text. And in the first 2 chapters of that, it's all about the fear of death and why that propels suffering. Thanks for that question.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, Professor Garfield. I am a big fan. I'm reading your books in the last 3 years.
Oh, how terrible.
And yeah. And I must say that they are very accessible and I love them. As of now, they are actually helping me with my thesis. I'm a philosophy student. So my question, and it actually troubled me for a long time, that different religions and different mystical traditions, this idea of immediacy, the presentness of present, has been very present not only in traditions like Jain, Tao, or Buddhism, but also in religions or traditions that speak about absolute, like the idea of, for example, in Hinduism, Brahman,
Yeah.
or in Kabbalah,
Yeah.
Yahweh. So you see, in most other religions, I find that there is this push given to the followers or the believers to attain this immediacy or to be very mindful. And I know that you have worked on mindfulness
Yeah.
at length. So I was just hoping that if you could comment on this idea of immediacy, of the presentness of the present in relation to 0 and 1, absolute and nothingness. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that, Prashant. It's a really good question. I think that a really deep insight in the Buddhist tradition, and one that we also find in the work of, say, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Sellers, and Paul in the West, but especially in the Buddhist tradition, is that the sense of immediacy is the deepest illusion that we've got and the hardest one to shake. And what happens in philosophy a lot, and this happens in every philosophical tradition I can think of, is that philosophers begin by taking what seems to be obviously true and then ramifying it into philosophical theory. So you start, think about Descartes taking what's obviously true, that I'm immediately aware of myself, and ramifying it into Cartesian dualism, right? You just want to hold your head and say, stop, 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 right? But I also want to say that to the Vedanta tradition and to the Nyaya tradition. I also want to say that to the Kantian tradition, because they start with the idea that if there's mediation, right? They start, hey, all of our knowledge of the external world is mediated, right? And then they say, but my self-knowledge, that's immediate, because if it's mediated, it's got to be mediated by something to which I've got immediate access. And then they develop a theory of immediacy. And I just want to say, stop, stop, stop. That idea that it was mediated, here's the cool part. It's mediated all the way down. So we start with an intellectual instinct, something that, Husserl called this beautifully, the natural attitude. That is, what's the way that it's just natural for us to think. We naturally think of our own self-knowledge as immediate. Here I am, present to myself. Everything else is problematic. But because something is natural, doesn't mean that it's correct. As I said, we evolved to reproduce, not to reproduce the world. So, think about optical illusions with which you're familiar, like my favorite one, the Mueller-Lyer illusion. It is natural to be fooled by the Mueller-Lyer illusion. That's a fact about our visual system that's wired. That doesn't mean that the two lines are actually different lengths, right? And so I see the attempt to develop philosophical theories of immediacy as just like somebody trying to explain why when you draw those arrowheads, the lines change length. The right thing to do is to explain why we're subject to the illusion. And that's what the Buddhist tradition tries to do. And I think that's the right way to think about this. Immediacy is just wired into us as one more illusion for which we've evolved to succumb to. Does that help a little?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. I actually have a book coming out about this very soon, about no self and the illusion of the self, for which we're also kind of wired.
So there is one comment in the chat box by Simran T. So can you read it, or do you want me to?
Yes, I can read it. I am reading it. What kind of impact do I think this complete rejection of immediacy has on conceptions of agency and situatedness? That's a really good question. Good question. Again, Shantideva addresses this kind of beautifully in the 6th chapter and the 8th chapter of Bodhicharya Avatars. I'm constantly referring people back to old dead guys. But I also think about this a lot in the forthcoming book I've got and in my other forthcoming book on Buddhist ethics. So if you want to find this in print, you can. Here's the big difference. The illusion of autonomy and subject-object duality leads us to conceive of our agency in what I call the Augustinian way. That is, of us as having a special kind of freedom to act on the causal order that's not constrained by the causal order. And people start referring to this as free will, right? That there's something that I can do that is uncaused. Now that's an idea. I mean, obviously, I know that I'm a physical organism in a physical world and that everything that happens to me is caused. I don't think that I'm magical. I don't think that somehow I intervene in the causal order. And I wouldn't want that either, because I do want my actions to be caused by my intentions. And I want my intentions to be caused by my perceptions and my beliefs and my desires. And I want those to be caused by my values and so on. Anything else would be randomness. And I don't want to just be moving randomly through the world. So, but nonetheless, we get this illusion of transcendental freedom. Instead, philosophers like Shantideva, but also David Hume, invite us to think of our agency through dependent origination and through causation, and say that instead of thinking of ourselves as free, uncaused centers of action, we should think of ourselves as parts of a much larger causal order. And so to think of our agency as agency within causation, not agency independent of causation. That's harder, but it has great merit. One thing that it does is it allows us to attribute less blame to other people when we recognize that their behavior is caused, and we can speculate on what its causes are. Reduces the amount of pride we have. There's this wonderful slogan that caused a lot of trouble in recent US presidential elections, which was, "You didn't build that," reminding rich industrialists that their wealth depended on an educational system and infrastructure and a banking system that they didn't build, right? That everything that we do is dependent on what other people do. So a sense of our own agency as conditioned allows us to develop a sense of gratitude to those around us, which is a very, very healthy thing, and a sense of responsibility. So I think that distributed causal agency, instead of localized independent agency, is a much more reasonable way of thinking about what it is to be a human being. And all of this brings us to more realistic ways. So as I said at the end, I think that the most terrible thing about these illusions for which we're wired is that they're self-alienating. They really take us away from who we are. And if we really think through who we really are, we see that we're different beings than we thought we were, but maybe more interesting and sensible beings that we could come to understand to some degree.
Thanks a lot. So that was a wonderful discussion. So we have to conclude the discussion now.
Okay.
Again, on behalf of our institute, we thank Professor Garfield for this remarkable lecture. And we sincerely hope that when he visits India, maybe next year or sometimes later, we hope that he will be able to visit us. You're welcome to visit us, and if possible, teach us a course.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real honor and a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day.